After nearly 2 decades of studying Elkhorn Slough, ecologist Brent Hughes had grown used to watching the ecosystem steadily decline. But in 2014, something happened that was very difficult to explain. Camera traps recorded a sudden surge in the sea otter population, a species that had once been slaughtered in massive numbers, with one count reaching as many as 120 individuals, the highest ever recorded. Yet just a few feet beneath the muddy surface, the exact opposite was happening. During one survey, Hughes pulled up trap after trap and noticed that creatures that had once packed them were now reduced to only a handful. He moved to another trap, then the next, comparing what he found with earlier records. The same pattern kept appearing. The most dangerous invasive crab species had disappeared. The two graphs were moving in opposite directions, but Hughes believed they were connected. Was some kind of human-led campaign causing both populations to change, or were the animals somehow affecting each other? It was not until 3 months later at Kirby Park, while Hughes was processing crabs from the traps, that a movement on the surface of the water caught his attention. What he witnessed next began to reveal the answer to a mystery that had persisted for so long and showed that the story was far more complicated than he had imagined. To understand what happened at Elkhorn Slough, we first need to understand what was killing this place. Once an important wetland in Monterey Bay, it supported countless birds, fish, and seagrass. But as agriculture expanded and Moss Landing Harbor intensified tidal flows, the land began to sink and the marsh edges were gradually washed away. By the early 2000s, more than half of the historic wetlands had disappeared, and the degradation was still continuing. More accurately, the decline once had a chance to stop. The roots of pickleweed along the marsh edges held the mud firmly in place, preventing it from being washed away. But the pickleweed gradually began to disappear. And this time, the cause was not humans. It was the invasive European green crab, which had been present here since 1993. At first, a few crabs were not a problem, but with too few predators to keep them under control, their numbers grew rapidly. They fed on pickleweed roots, consumed bottom-dwelling organisms, disrupted the ecological balance, and dug millions of burrows, leaving the marsh banks increasingly hollow and unstable. In the early 2000s, Ricky Jeppesen and Brent Hughes began monitoring the green crab population. They repeatedly set traps, counted and measured the crabs, and removed them from multiple areas across Elkhorn Slough. But manual trapping mainly helped them track the population. The number of crabs remained high. Despite years of effort, they still had not found a method powerful enough to cause a clear decline in this invasive species. Everything truly began to change when the number of sea otters started rising. But there was a problem. There had been no otters here before, and no one had released them into the area. So where did they come from? More than a century ago, sea otters were hunted for their fur until they nearly disappeared from most of the West Coast, and for decades, people around Elkhorn Slough did not see them at all. But in 1984, the first otters swam into the estuary on their own, following the calm tidal channels filled with crabs and shellfish, and gradually began to stay. At first, there were only about 15 of them. In 1997, an orphaned sea otter named Harmony was rescued beneath a cliff more than 100 feet high and later released here. 2 years later, she appeared with a pup. After that, more orphaned otters were also brought to the area, and the population gradually grew to nearly 100 animals. Today, Elkhorn Slough has one of the highest densities of sea otters in California. And remember, no one brought the species back here. The otters found this place on their own. That is extremely important because sea otters are not ordinary animals. Ecologists call them a keystone species because even a change in sea otter numbers can reshape the entire ecosystem beneath them. Off the coast of California, this effect had already been seen very clearly. Sea otters eat sea urchins, urchin numbers fall, and kelp forests get a chance to grow. When sea otters disappear, sea urchins explode in number, graze the kelp down to the roots, and leave behind barren, rocky seafloors. But at Elkhorn Slough, no one expected such a small animal to trigger an even more complicated chain of effects. And now, back to the question we most want answered. The thing Brent Hughes saw at Kirby Park in 2014. That day, Hughes was standing along the shore, processing European green crabs he had just pulled from the traps. As he bent down to sort them, a sea otter surfaced nearby. It dove underwater, then came back up a few seconds later, holding a crab between its front paws. After eating it, the otter dove again. Then it resurfaced, with another crab. Hughes stopped what he was doing and began counting. In about an hour, a single sea otter ate nearly 30 green crabs. Suddenly, the two lines on the graphs from the beginning of the story started to make sense. But Hughes still could not draw a conclusion from a single observation. In July 2015, the research team tried to test the idea with a captive sea otter named Selka at UC Santa Cruz. Selka had never encountered a European green crab before. The scientists placed crabs into an experimental setup, even keeping one inside a plastic container to test her response. Selka quickly approached and ate the crab. Sea otters clearly did not need to be taught that this invasive species was food, and that made sense given how their bodies work. Unlike seals or whales, sea otters do not have a thick layer of blubber to keep them warm in cold water. To survive without that insulation, they have to burn energy at an extremely high rate, which means they need to eat almost constantly each day. They may consume food equal to about a quarter of their body weight. Crabs, clams, sea urchins, and other bottom-dwelling animals are therefore constantly being hunted. When the researchers combined data collected from 1999 to 2017, the true scale of the effect became clear. They analyzed 26,429 foraging dives, of which sea otters successfully captured prey on 16,117 dives. Nearly 23.5% of the identified prey were crabs. With an average population of about 80 otters during the calculation period after 2013, the researchers estimated that sea otters could consume around 328 green crabs per day, nearly 120,000 a year. Even the most conservative estimates still came out to tens of thousands of crabs. Their impact did not stop with the traps becoming emptier and emptier. A chain reaction began spreading across the marsh. Here, we need to make an important distinction. Besides the invasive green crab, sea otters also prey on many native shore crabs, small crabs that often dig deep burrows into the marsh banks and feed on vegetation. As sea otter numbers increased, predation pressure on these crabs increased as well. Fewer crabs meant fewer tunnels cutting through the mud. The pickleweed plants that had once been chewed away began holding onto their root systems, gripping the soil like tiny anchors. With each passing tidal season, the difference became more visible. Sections of shoreline where sea otters regularly foraged retained thicker vegetation, while in areas with heavy crab activity, the mud continued to be hollowed out until chunks of the bank eventually collapsed into the water. But the scientists did not simply stand on the shore, observe what was happening, and draw a conclusion. They set up experimental plots across 5 tidal creeks, preventing sea otters from reaching certain sections while still allowing the crabs to behave normally. Over the years, the areas where otters were excluded had more crabs and more burrows, while the banks continued to weaken. In contrast, the sections where otters were allowed to hunt remained noticeably more stable. When the researchers expanded the comparison across the entire system, the results surprised the team. In areas where sea otters had recovered, the rate of marsh edge erosion dropped by an average of about 69%. Do you think the sea otter's impact stopped at reducing crab numbers and protecting the marsh banks? It did not. Get ready for what we are about to tell you, because thanks to them, an extremely rare species returned. Now look down at the eelgrass beds. On the surface of every blade, algae are always growing. Under normal conditions, sea slugs and small crustaceans graze on that algae, helping the grass receive enough sunlight. But crabs prey on those tiny grazers. When crab numbers get too high, these cleanup crews disappear. Algae builds up more heavily, and the eelgrass gradually weakens. Then the sea otters increased. They ate the crabs. Crab numbers fell. Sea slugs and other algae-eating species recovered. The layer of algae on the eelgrass blades became thinner, and sunlight could once again reach the bottom. Patch by patch, eelgrass began reconnecting into larger green meadows. What is remarkable is that nutrient-rich runoff from agriculture was still flowing into Elkhorn Slough. The pollution had not disappeared. What changed was the structure of the food web, allowing the ecosystem to resist the pressure more effectively. But the return of sea otters also created a paradox. They do not distinguish between invasive crabs and the species humans want to harvest. Sea otters also eat clams, crabs, abalone, and sea urchins. A 2020 study published in Science in British Columbia estimated that sea otter recovery could increase total ecosystem biomass by about 37%, while also increasing the value generated from fisheries carbon storage, and tourism. But for some shellfish fisheries, that same recovery could also mean lower yields. Sea otters are helping nature recover, but that recovery does not benefit everyone in the same way. But there was still another problem. Elkhorn Slough continued to receive large amounts of nutrients from the surrounding agricultural areas. By conventional logic, more nitrogen should mean more algae, less light reaching the bottom, and continued decline of the eelgrass beds. But instead, they were turning green again. Hughes examined water temperature, weather, upwelling, and many other factors. None of them could fully explain what was happening. Then, when the sea otter data were placed alongside the eelgrass data, a chain of connections began to emerge. Sea otters do not eat algae, and they certainly do not plant a single blade of grass. They eat crabs. Those crabs, in turn, prey on sea slugs and small crustaceans that graze on the algae growing on eelgrass leaves. As sea otter numbers increased, crab numbers fell, allowing those tiny cleanup crews to return. They grazed down the algae, more sunlight reached the seafloor, and patches of eelgrass began to expand. Hughes and his team published this mechanism in PNAS in 2013. What is remarkable is that the agricultural nutrient runoff was still there. Elkhorn Slough did not suddenly become a perfectly clean body of water. What changed was the structure of the food web, and that helped the ecosystem withstand the pressure more effectively. Humans later tried to push this recovery even further. Scientists collected 2,340 eelgrass shoots and planted them in 117 experimental plots on the estuary floor. Over the next few years, those small patches expanded to cover an area about 85 times larger than where they started. The new green eelgrass beds then created shelter and nursery habitat for Dungeness crab, California halibut, Pacific herring, and many other species. By this point, an ecological loop had formed. Sea otters helped the eelgrass recover, and the recovering eelgrass in turn helped make the entire ecosystem richer and more diverse. While sea otters were quietly helping stabilize the marsh by hunting crabs, humans were using excavators, trucks, and millions of dollars to do something similar in other parts of Elkhorn Slough. Starting in 2004, managers launched the Tidal Wetland Project, a large-scale effort to rescue marsh areas that had sunk too low. At Hester Marsh, truck after truck hauled soil into the site. Hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of sediment were added to raise the marsh surface back to the proper tidal elevation. Old tidal channels were reopened, the land was reshaped, and about 17,000 marsh plants were planted during the first phase. The ultimate goal was to restore roughly 122 acres of degraded habitat. It was a massive engineering project. But not far from the excavators, sea otters were doing part of the same job in a completely different way. They did not build levees. They did not haul soil. They did not plant pickleweed. They simply ate crabs. Brian Silliman and his colleagues estimated that if humans had to use engineering projects to achieve a similar level of shoreline stabilization, the cost could reach tens of millions of dollars. This is where sea otters became a very clear example of how a predator can function as a nature-based solution. But this story is not a fairy tale, because nature does not divide species into good and bad based on what benefits humans. Sea otters do not only eat European green crabs, they also prey on Dungeness crabs, clams, sea urchins, abalone, and many other economically valuable shellfish. In some habitats within Elkhorn Slough, researchers recorded declines in the number or size of juvenile Dungeness crabs as sea otter numbers increased. At first glance, that may seem like a price that has to be paid, but then another paradox appeared. Sea otters eat juvenile crabs, yet the eelgrass beds they indirectly help restore also provide shelter and nursery habitat for those same young crabs. A predator can therefore remove part of a population while at the same time helping build the habitat that population needs to survive. The story of Elkhorn Slough did not end when the marsh began to recover. In fact, the success of one small estuary in California led scientists to ask a much bigger question. In 2002, Elkhorn Slough was estimated to have only about 20 sea otters. Just over a decade later, by 2015, that number had climbed to nearly 150, an increase of more than sevenfold. They grew, found food, established territories, and gave birth to a new generation in the wild. Population modeling later showed that 37 sea otters and their descendants contributed about 55% of the total growth of the Elkhorn Slough population. One of the first major milestones came in 2008, when Sea Otter 339, released 4 years earlier, appeared at the surface with a pup and successfully raised it. By around 2017, Elkhorn Slough was even considered to be approaching its carrying capacity for sea otters. A program that had started by rescuing individual orphans had now helped create a population that was close to sustaining itself. And beneath those otters, the landscape was changing as well. Crabs were being kept under control, eelgrass was expanding, habitat for fish and invertebrates was improving, and marsh banks in many areas were eroding more slowly. On the 5th of October 2018, Elkhorn Slough was designated a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention. But that very success made people start looking beyond the estuary. If a few dozen sea otters could create such a large effect here, what might happen if they were returned to coastal areas where they had been absent for more than a century? In 2022, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service completed a major assessment of the feasibility of reintroducing sea otters to Northern California and Oregon, the large gap between existing populations along the Pacific coast. What is especially interesting is that the models did not necessarily begin with hundreds of animals. One scenario tested the release of just 5 juvenile sea otters per year for 5 years, for a total of 25 animals. On computer screens, researchers watched those small dots reproduce, disperse, and form populations over the course of decades. At some locations, the impact was modest, but in the San Francisco Bay model, the median result after 50 years showed that the total southern sea otter population could come close to doubling from the model's initial population of about 3,000 animals. This was not an approved plan, but it showed how Elkhorn Slough had changed the way people thought about sea otter recovery. Perhaps a massive release was not necessary. Sometimes all that was needed was to establish a small population capable of surviving, reproducing, and expanding on its own. However, taking that idea across hundreds of miles of coastline is far more difficult. The USFWS estimated that a reintroduction program under the scenario studied could cost about $26 million to $43 million over 13 years, from initial surveys to release and long-term monitoring, but money may not even be the biggest obstacle. Sea otters do not only eat invasive crabs, they also eat clams, mussels, sea urchins, crabs, and many other shellfish that fishermen and coastal communities depend on. So something that could restore kelp and seagrass in one place could also change fisheries somewhere else. Those questions directly affect fishermen, tribes, and many communities that have depended on the ocean for generations. That is why, instead of immediately opening cages and releasing sea otters, the USFWS traveled along the coast in 2023, holding meetings in 16 communities from Astoria, Oregon, to San Francisco Bay, listening to the people who might have to live with the consequences of that decision. An experiment that seemed to begin simply as an effort to save a few orphaned sea otters at Elkhorn Slough ultimately became a model for a much larger question about how to restore the entire west coast of the United States. And this time, the question is no longer whether sea otters can change an ecosystem. Elkhorn Slough has already shown that they can. If you visit Elkhorn Slough today, you can still see sea otters floating on their backs in the tidal channels, wrapping eelgrass around their bodies so they are not carried away by the current while they sleep. A little later, they dive to the bottom, surface with a crab between their front paws, and calmly crack open its shell right on their chests. They have no idea that every meal like this is helping keep the entire marsh more stable. They are simply hungry, and perhaps that is the strangest part of this story. For more than 100 years, humans have believed that if we want to save a collapsing shoreline, we need soil, rock, concrete, excavators, and millions of dollars. But at Elkhorn Slough, part of that work is being done by an animal that weighs only a few dozen pounds. Sea otters do not plant pickleweed, they do not move sediment, and they do not build any kind of structure. They simply hunt crabs. But from that small action, crab numbers decline, plant roots remain intact, seagrass recovers, and erosion rates in many areas drop dramatically. Scientists call this a nature-based solution. When a link that was once removed from an ecosystem is returned to its proper place, sometimes nature can do on its own what takes humans decades to understand. And the biggest question is no longer just what sea otters have done for Elkhorn Slough. It is this: how many other species have we removed from nature without ever realizing that they were quietly holding an entire ecosystem together? If you want to keep exploring true stories about how animals are changing and restoring nature in ways no one expected, subscribe to the channel and don't miss the next video, because the next story may begin with a species humans once saw as a problem, only for it to become part of the solution.